Good morning to all our attendees and thank you for joining us. I am Sarah Gon. I'm the Head of Strategic Engagement and the Director of the Free Speech Union of South Africa, and I'm your host for this morning. I want to welcome you to this online media briefing for the launch of the IRR's latest report, which is Overcoming the Odds: Why School Vouchers Would Benefit Poor South Africans. Basically, the report calls for a radical change to our basic education and proposes solutions to turn education into a proper basis for personal development. Now, the briefing will be presented by Caiden Lang, IRR researcher and the author of the report, and he'll present a summary of his findings. After the presentation, we will hold a discussion of the findings with IRR Project and Publications Manager, Terence Corrigan. There will also be an opportunity for the media to ask questions about the report through Q&A through the comments. And now, may I welcome and introduce your presenter for the morning, Caiden Lang. Caiden, welcome.
Cool. Thank you very much, Sarah, for that introduction. And yeah, hi to all the attendees. I'm really happy that you can make it. Cool. I'm just going to jump straight into it. So the IRR has written a report, as Sarah mentioned, called Overcoming the Odds: Why School Vouchers Would Benefit Poor South Africans. And so today I'm just going to give you a brief overview of the report, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions. I'm just going to start off with a quote by Nelson Mandela, one of my favorite quotes. It might seem a little bit idealistic, but I think ultimately it is right. In A Long Walk to Freedom, Nelson Mandela described education as the great engine of personal development. It is through education, he said, that the daughter of a peasant can become a doctor, that the son of a mine worker can become the head of the mine, and that the child of a farm worker can become the president of a great nation. In other words, education has the potential to level the playing field, or as American education reformer Horace Mann once put it, education can be the great equalizer of the conditions of men. But as a jumping off point, I'd like to contrast Mr. Mandela's vision for education in South Africa with something that Professor Nick Spall wrote in the opening chapter of the 2019 book, South African Schooling: The Enigma of Inequality. He said, quote, 2 decades after apartheid, it is still the case that the life chances of the average South African child are determined not by their ability or the result of hard work and determination, but instead by the color of their skin, the province of their birth, and the wealth of their parents. These realities are so deterministic that before a child's 7th birthday, one can predict with some precision whether they will inherit a life of chronic poverty and sustained unemployment, or a dignified life and meaningful work. Despite some isolated successes, most notably an equitable funding of schools and almost universal grade 1 enrollment, the post-apartheid government has utterly failed in its mission to provide most children with an education of sufficient quality to help them improve their quality of life. So the purpose of this report is to propose a plan, a possible solution to the education crisis in the country, to add to the marketplace of ideas, a plan that could turn our education system into a great engine of personal development. Or to put it another way, to propose a plan that, if implemented, will make it so that the life chances of a 7-year-old cannot be predicted with any precision based on factors outside of their control. So to conceive of such a plan, it's necessary to get to grips with what exactly is ailing our education system. And to nail this down, I chose to draw a comparison between schools that are performing and those that aren't, and seize on what I think is the main difference between the two, which is accountability or lack thereof at various levels of the system. So the report is divided into 4 sections. Section 1 looks at some key measures of performance and pays special attention to inequality in outcomes between pupils attending free schools and those paying for education at former Model C and independent schools. In Section 2, I explain why early grade literacy and numeracy are the 2 learning areas most worthy of attention. Section 3 discusses the barriers to improving early grade literacy and numeracy and concludes by looking at some important administrative differences between schools that are failing and those that aren't. And finally, Section 4 makes the case that the most sensible way to removing the barriers discussed in Section 3 is to implement a school voucher program along with several other targeted interventions. So I'm going to begin with the inequality crisis. I mean, a simple question, how bad is it really? Well, the short answer is that it is pretty terrible. By now, anyone interested in education in South Africa will be familiar with how poorly we fare on international benchmark tests and pupil retention rates. But just to refresh your memories, in 2015, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, ranked the education systems of 76 countries on how high school pupils fared in maths and science tests. South Africa came 75th, one place ahead of Ghana. In the 2019 Trends in International Mathematics and Science study, South Africa's grade 5s were placed 62nd out of 64 countries for maths and science. And in both instances, South Africa was placed only above Pakistan and the Philippines. According to the latest Progress in International Reading Literacy study, the PIRLS, 81% of grade 4s cannot retrieve basic information from a given text to answer simple questions in any language. One particularly telling measure of educational performance is the pupil retention rate read against the matric pass rate. Out of the 1,062,510 pupils enrolled in grade 10 in 2020, 31.8% dropped out before writing their matric exam in 2022. The proportion of South African pupils who begin grade 1 and go on to pass matric in grade 12, usually fluctuates at around 40%. Now if you compare these figures to Turkey, 53%, Brazil 67%, and Chile 72%, it just gives some indication of how bad South Africa is doing in terms of its throughput rate. And as if these numbers weren't bad enough, the real tragedy and the focus of this report can be seen in the inequality of outcomes. In 2018, the top 3% of South African high schools, the majority of which charge pretty significant fees, produced more mathematics distinctions than the remaining 97% put together. Using Spall's calculations based on the 2016 PIRLS data, 71% of grade 4 pupils attending the richest 10% of schools can read at a basic level, compared to 16% attending the remaining 90% of schools. 48% of Black grade 3 pupils pass mathematics, compared to 85% of white pupils. And independent schools, 84% of grade 5s can do mathematics in accordance with international norms, compared to 67% in fee-charging public schools and 25% in no-fee public schools. So what these data suggest is that today, as during apartheid, South Africa effectively has multiple education systems. And although a measure of apartheid's inertia is evident in that on average, educational outcomes between races differ quite significantly. In contrast to the situation prevailing during apartheid, where racist policies accounted for the discrepancies, the biggest determinant of inequitable outcomes between racial groups today, as Spall writes, is whether the school charges fees or not, and if it does, how large those fees are. I'll return to this point later on, but first I want to focus on what exactly is to blame for the education crisis. And I thought that understanding why pupils drop out of school is a good starting point when considering meaningful interventions that will lead to improvement. While there are a number of reasons why pupils drop out of school before matric, including pregnancy, financial stress, and choosing to leave school after grade 9, Senior Research Fellow in the University of Cape Town's School of Economics, Nicola Branson, along with her colleagues drew on data from the National Income Dynamics study to show that not keeping pace at school is a fundamental determinant of who drops out, and that falling behind at school is strongly correlated with socioeconomic status and school quality in South Africa. Why are poor children falling behind? Well, the main reason is that the vast majority of poor children attending free public schools, 98% of whose pupils are Black or colored, cannot read or do basic maths by grade 4. And since learning is a cumulative process, particularly when it comes to maths, children who do not master basic concepts in the first few years of primary school are at a perpetual disadvantage. The significance of this fact cannot be overstated. Take reading as an example. If a child cannot read by the end of grade 4, they cannot engage with the rest of the curriculum in any meaningful way. And that's because in grades 1 to 3, the curriculum focuses on learning to read and thereafter on reading to learn. So a child who cannot read by grade 4 will inevitably fall behind because they will have trouble understanding the content of the curriculum from grade 4 onwards. Many pupils would just be pushed through the grades until eventually they become really despondent and they drop out of school, usually between grade 10 and matric. And those children very, very often will just leave school to join the masses of the unemployed. So I think that focusing on early grade literacy and numeracy should be of the highest priority for anyone looking to improve learning outcomes among poor South Africans. But to come up with meaningful interventions, we need to know why poor children are so far behind their middle class peers. So what are the barriers to early grade reading and literacy that disproportionately affect poor children? Well, school readiness is one. Okay, an investigation into the early roots of reading failure in the Western Cape, published this year, Hofmeyr explains that, quote, socioeconomic status clearly plays a role in determining learners' readiness to start formal schooling, with children from wealthier backgrounds being much more likely to start school developmentally on track. While a discussion of more the reasons why this is the case is outside the scope of this report, some of the factors include the fact that poor children are less likely to get a sufficient nutritional intake, which affects their cognitive development. Poor children are less likely than middle and upper class children to attend a pre-primary school, and then when they do, it's just not of the same quality. Poor children are less likely to have educated parents who will read to them and who will teach them about the value of reading and who can afford to buy books. And poor children are disproportionately from broken homes, which means they just don't receive the same amount of attention and care as those from stable middle-class homes. The fact that there's a correlation, albeit an imperfect one, between socioeconomic status and school preparedness highlights just how important it is that we really focus on early grade reading and numeracy. Insofar as possible, the value of a good primary school lies in its ability to nullify the role that poverty plays on childhood and early childhood development, which brings me to the quality of teaching. No education system can proceed beyond the competency of its teachers. For pupils to achieve a competency in maths and reading, the person charged with teaching them must first be competent in those disciplines, and second, have the pedagogical know-how to be able to teach effectively. This is a very common sense idea. Unfortunately, South African teachers perform really, really poorly, particularly those teaching in free public schools. When it comes to literacy, although there's no systematic evidence regarding the state of subject-specific knowledge held by South African primary school teachers, there's much to suggest that the majority are not equipped to help pupils achieve even the intermediate PILS benchmark. According to Nick Taylor, in a representative sample of grade 6 language teachers in South Africa, 45% struggled with reading comprehension tasks requiring straightforward inferences, and 26%, there you go. And 26% even battled with retrieving information explicitly stated in a test. These are teachers, just to remind you. Regarding numeracy, in 2007, the Southern and Eastern Africa Consortium for Monitoring Educational Quality, SACMEC, tested the content knowledge of a representative sample of South African grade 6 maths teachers. The results showed that 79% of teachers could not achieve 60% or higher on the test. And in quintile 1 schools, those serving the poorest pupils, 89% of teachers did not have the mathematical content knowledge on par with the level that they were teaching. So why aren't our primary school teachers qualified? Well, the problem originates, according to Taylor and Mawoyo and many others, in university education departments. With respect to primary school teachers, Taylor and Mawoyo indicate that teacher educators, with few exceptions, have in the past paid only lip service to policies set by government, neglected the poor language proficiency of their students, and given scant attention to research on literary pedagogy. The result of this is that newly qualified teachers, through no fault of their own, are just not prepared to teach the curriculum. Further exacerbating the problem is that, according to results from the national benchmark tests, which are taken by 75% of university applicants annually, not only is it the academically weakest students enrolling for B.Ed programs, but nearly a third of applicants exhibit serious learning challenges with respect to academic literacy, with a further 47% requiring academic support. As is the case with content knowledge, when it comes to pedagogical knowledge, that is knowing how to teach, South African universities are also failing their students. According to a 2020 report compiled by Yvonne Reed, a study of 16 of the 24 universities offering B.Ed courses for primary school teachers revealed that only 7 of them offered modules that focused on the teaching of reading. In a separate study, researchers from Jet Education Services found that out of the 12 universities in South Africa offering B.Ed courses in Sotho or Zulu, not a single one offered a module dedicated to the teaching of reading. I mean, yeah, that is quite shocking. A third barrier to success is school management or school mismanagement. Research by the Department of Education in 2017 and 2018 found that in the whole of South Africa, on aggregate, teachers were absent from school on an average day went up to 10% from 8% in 2011. A high rate of teacher absenteeism has always been a problem, an unfortunate feature of South African schooling. Data collected during the SACMEC study in 2000 showed that between 97 and 100% of principals of schools in quintiles 1 to 4 reported that teacher absenteeism was a problem, compared to 26% of principals in quintile 5 schools. Although this information is quite dated, it appears that the issue remains very much alive. As reported by SPOR, the 2007 SACMEC data finds that the average grade 6 mathematics teacher in South Africa reported being absent from school for 19 days annually. The figure was much higher in the poorest 20% of schools, which was 23 days, compared with the wealthiest 20% of schools, which was 11 days. South Africa has the highest rate of teacher absenteeism in the Southern African Development Community. In 2012, at 19 days per teacher. For comparison, the average in other SADC countries is 9 days per teacher. Furthermore, 77% of teacher absences in South Africa fall on a Monday or a Friday, suggesting that while absenteeism is often justified, that's not always the case. Arguably, the failure of school principals to enforce standards of professionalism comes down to the fact that the principals themselves are not being held to account for their own lack of professionalism. In fact, it can be argued, and I make the argument in the report, that the main difference between free public schools and fee-paying schools, particularly independent schools in general, is the lack of accountability in the former. And this brings me to the crux of the report. The most impactful privilege afforded to pupils at fee-paying and independent schools, and one that plays a role in the quality of education and the quality of dedication of the teachers at these schools, is attending a school where poor performance is met with consequences. Ultimately, the downfall of South Africa's education system is its lack of accountability. This is, more than any other feature, the one responsible for the huge discrepancy in pupil outcomes between the rich and the poor. Now, one might respond by saying, okay, but surely it's all about the money, isn't it? I mean, more money, you can pay your teachers better, which means they'll be more dedicated, you have more resources, etc. But that's not exactly quite right. Although fee status is a very important predictor of outcomes, in the South African context, the fees themselves are not causally sufficient to explain the difference in educational outcomes. Drawing on the pass rates from the 2004 Senior Certificate Mathematics exams, Cristiano colleagues found that the pass rate in the Senior Certificate exam show the full range of variation from 0% to 100% in schools classed in all 5 poverty quintiles, leading the researchers to conclude that there is no deterministic relationship between performance and financial resources. And many other researchers have arrived at similar conclusions. A very compelling piece of evidence in support of this claim, in support of the claim that money alone is not sufficient in accounting for the vast discrepancy in pupil performance, is that there are many free and low fee schools in South Africa that produce very good results. If the amount of money available to a school was sufficient to explain pupil performance, we would not expect to find successful poor or middle quintile schools that are succeeding where similar schools are not. However, as reported by Cristiano colleagues, as well as John Caiden Berman and many others, this is not the case at all. According to 2 separate surveys commissioned by the Department of Education, a feature common to poor schools that succeed is that stakeholders have a sense of responsibility and shared enterprise, a culture of hard work, and high value attached to good performance. In other words, principals were focused, teachers dedicated, and pupils motivated. Likewise, in a study of successful poor schools by Cristiano colleagues, all 18 of them were found to have no significant degree of late coming or absenteeism among either teachers or pupils. These features all point to effective accountability structures as the secret to success, a feature generally absent from the majority of free public schools. A shocking consequence of the absence of accountability in the public sector is the presence of what Nick Spohr refers to as cognitive wastelands. These are schools where not a single grade 4 pupil can read in their home language and make inferences. And this is the case in 45% of South African grade 4 classrooms. That the problem has been allowed to reach such proportions is indicative of the fact that the education department lacks the capacity and the will to hold failing schools to account. The 2 main reasons, I think, are a general lack of bureaucratic competence, and very importantly, the political influence of the country's majority teacher union, the South African Democratic Teachers Union, or SATU. A 2016 report commissioned by the Department of Education and led by Professor John Volmink to investigate fraud and corruption in the education sector found that SATU was in de facto control of the education department in 6 of South Africa's 9 provinces, those being KwaZulu-Natal, Limpopo, the Eastern Cape, the Northwest, Mpumalanga, and Gauteng. A feature of SATU's control over education departments is that it wields a corrupting influence over hiring and firing decisions regarding teachers, principals, and administrators within the department. SATU's allegiance lies first and foremost with its members. Now, this can be expected of a workers' union. However, what makes this particular instance really poisonous is that it prioritizes the interests of its members over that of school children. And as the Volmink report showed, SATU officials regularly accept bribes in exchange for promotions within the education system and interfere in teacher disciplinary hearings, making it extremely difficult for schools to fire poorly performing teachers. None of this would be possible if it weren't for the fact that powerful figures within the education department are members of SATU, despite not being teachers themselves. The investigators of the report wrote that all deputy directors general in the Department of Education are SATU members and attend meetings of that union, leading them to conclude that it is not improbable to say that schooling throughout South Africa is run by SATU. The desire for accountability within an education system is evidenced by the fact that poor parents in developing countries across the world are voting with their feet and choosing to send their children to low-cost private schools instead of entrusting their children's education to free public schools, despite the extra costs required. The main reason why they are doing so is that they believe that the quality of education is better at independent schools, based primarily on the fact that they are subject to market forces. Independent schools have to perform or risk the dissatisfaction of their customers, the parents, who will look elsewhere if standards are not met. A common misconception about independent schools is that they are for the rich. The Center for Development and Enterprise, the CDE, has probably done the most extensive research on the rise of low-cost independent schools in South Africa. Research conducted in 2015 by the CDE led them to estimate that 250,000 children in South Africa are being educated in independent schools, charging fees below 12,000 Rand a year. Investigating the reasons for the increasing preference for independent schools, even among the poor, Dr. Jane Hofmeyr writes that studies undertaken of the factors behind this trend and the performance of these schools provide a very clear lesson. In system reform, accountability matters. That there is generally more accountability in independent schools should come as no surprise. As noted above, in independent schools, parents are the customers, and therefore, if they are unsatisfied with the school, they will take their children elsewhere. This in turn creates an incentive for the school governing body to hold principals to account for their performance, which then increases the likelihood that the principals will hold their teachers to account for their performance. In short, if an independent school does not produce the outcomes desired by parents, the school will be forced to close down. This is evidently not the case in the public sector, where underperforming schools continue to operate, even in cases where they can be considered cognitive wastelands. So to conclude this section, independent and former Model C schools vastly outperform ordinary public schools. One reason is that high fee-paying schools can afford to purchase extra resources, have smaller class sizes, and attract better teachers overall. However, considering that there are poor public schools managing to succeed, and that what they have in common is more robust systems of accountability, this suggests that the wealth a school is able to gather in fees is not the most important variable in producing good pupil performance. The most important causal factor seems to be whether a school and its managers are held accountable for their performance. So, what can be done? Well, the most important priority should be, as I've discussed, to improve the rates of early grade literacy and numeracy in public primary schools, particularly schools serving poor areas. Doing so, however, is not straightforward, given that poor children are likely to begin school underprepared, be taught by incompetent teachers prone to absenteeism, and attend schools that lack robust systems of accountability. The question, and this is the key, I think, the question of how to improve early grade literacy and numeracy is a matter of finding a way to replicate the accountability model of independent schools across the system whilst ensuring affordability. The Institute of Race Relations proposes that the most reasonable way to achieve this is to implement a school voucher system. The IRR is a classically liberal think tank, and as such is generally in favor of decentralization and maximizing individual freedom. However, the argument presented in the report is more of a pragmatic response that seeks an answer to the question, under the current South African circumstance, what would work the quickest to improve education? Answering the question, CEO of the IRR, John Endres, writes, school vouchers are probably a key element in achieving that improvement, because you've got to bring the forces of supply and demand to bear on the education system to lift performance. Under the current system, there are no consequences for bad performance. In contrast, with school vouchers, there would be. Underperforming schools would see themselves starved of funding unless they get their act together. So how does a school voucher system work? Well, it's effectively a universal bursary program. Parents would be given a voucher per child per year to the value of about 16,000 Rand, which is roughly the equivalent of per capita government spend on a pupil today, to be used to purchase education at a school of their choice, whether it be an ordinary public school, a former Model C school, or an independent school. The school would then submit the vouchers to the government, which would electronically transfer the equivalent amount to the school's bank account. In cases where a voucher might not be sufficient to match the fees of a school, parents would have the option of paying the difference. Public schools would be responsible for paying staff salaries with the money redeemed from the vouchers, thereby making staff accountable to the school governing body rather than the state and to SATU. If a voucher system were implemented, it would inevitably result in the closure of underperforming public schools, as these schools would experience an exodus of pupils and therefore capital to run the school. In these cases, the facilities could be auctioned off to private schooling organizations like Spark or Curra and others, including individual entrepreneurs, as we've actually seen in other places around the world. School buildings could be refurbished and new schools opened. Not only would a voucher system improve accountability, it would enable poor parents to exercise choice over their children's futures where none exists currently. The voucher system would increase accountability and parental control over education, but what of the fact that poor children are shown to be less prepared to learn when they enter grade 1 compared to their wealthier peers? And the problem of poor teacher education. Well, vouchers might prove to be of assistance here too, as vouchers would bring market forces to bear on the system. Schools that prioritized early grade reading and numeracy would attract more customers. This would incentivize schools to implement targeted interventions that would help poor children to make up for lost learning time as a result of insufficient early childhood development. In addition, as schools would be competing for pupil attendance, it might be in the interests of schools to publish their early grade literacy and numeracy results on an annual basis. This would result in schools producing poor results, having to prioritize literacy or numeracy, or risk failing to attract parents. In order to produce competent readers and mathematicians, schools need competent teachers, as I've already spoken about. Education departments attract the weakest high school graduates and have been found wanting when it comes to producing primary school teachers. So if schools competed for customers, this might incentivize them to allocate some portion of collected fees to seeking out and funding bright matriculants to complete their education degrees on condition that they're employed at the school for a particular duration. Okay, so that's the voucher system. I just want to briefly speak about 3 other targeted interventions. An added benefit of reducing the burden on the state of providing education is that the education department could focus a growing proportion of its efforts on research, improving access to and ensuring the quality of early childhood centers, and implementing mass awareness campaigns trumpeting the importance of childhood literacy and of parents reading to their children. But alongside these broad strokes ideas, targeted interventions to improve pupil outcomes should be prioritized. A national reading plan should be conceived of and put into action. University education departments need to be audited and held to account, as should teacher unions. For a more detailed discussion of these 3 interventions, please see the report. So to recap, the major finding was that poor pupil performance in early grade literacy and numeracy is setting children, particularly poor Black children, up for failure. The lack of effective accountability on behalf of the state presents the biggest barrier to improving early grade literacy and numeracy, abetted by university education departments that mostly fail to prepare their primary school teachers for teaching effectively. The IRR believes that implementing a school voucher system would be the most effective way to improve basic education in South Africa. It would achieve this by simultaneously removing the responsibility of educating South Africans from the state and putting it back in the hands of those most invested in their children's futures, their parents. Doing so would bring market forces to bear on the education system, thereby ensuring more effective accountability structures and removing the harmful influence of corrupt teacher unions. Much research has been done on the success or lack thereof of a school voucher system across the world. There is much to learn about the most effective way to implement the system. Should vouchers only be provided to those of a certain socioeconomic class, or should they be handed out universally? What should happen if the value of a voucher exceeds the tuition fees of a school? And how can parents from wealthy homes give up their vouchers out of a sense of charity and ensure that they are put to good use and not stolen by the state? And how would parents gain sufficient insight into their school's revenue and expenditure to ensure resources are well spent? These are just a few of the many questions that will need to be answered if such a system were to be put in place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caiden. I'm now going to turn over to Terence to draw more out on this.
Yeah, I'm the one who likes to ask the questions. Thank you, Caiden. That was most enlightening, and as somebody who's kind of tracked your work through this from the beginning, it's wonderful to see it all coming together. Something that I doubt our viewers would be aware of is that I spent a couple of years as a teacher. Let me say that I think that this is a vocation, not just a job, to which not everybody is temperamentally suited. And I think that a successful education system, one of the intangibles is that we are able to honor, respect, and give status to those who do it well, and not incentivize teaching as a fallback career for sort of sheltered employment. Yeah, we are open for questions from those joining us online. But let me pose something to Caiden. I think that something that comes out very, very clearly from your presentation is the question of accountability. In fact, I think that you said that this is fundamentally the linchpin on which any success or failure of the education system will hinge. And intrinsic to that is, of course, the question of union influence. And this is no longer a sort of ideological conspiracy theory the government's own investigation has shown that this is a rather toxic situation. So the question that I'm gonna bat to you is, what do we do about it? How do we actually manage this? This is intensely political. If you think about it, the ANC's union allies have become increasingly white collar over the past 3 decades, and I believe possibly the largest, certainly one of the largest, is the South African Democratic Teachers Union. Very, very useful, particularly around election time when you need muscle to do your canvassing. So, over to you, Caiden. What do we do about this?
Yeah, my answer is probably quite short there, Terence, and that's just to say that I think a big problem is that so many administrators in the department, high up administrators, are members of SATU, and that just creates conflicts of interest. I mean, if you're trying to, say, negotiate for teacher salaries or for budgets and that kind of thing, I mean, who are, are you on the side of, what's best for the schools, or are you on the side of what's best for the union that you're part of? So that doesn't really make sense to me, because you are just inevitably going to get these conflicts of interest. So I think, although it might pose some constitutional questions, I would make it so that perhaps you had to be a teacher or actually work in a school to actually be a member of a teacher union, as opposed to an administrator.
Right.
Yeah, but
look,
more than happy to take other ideas.
Well, no, I think that's an extremely important insight. We often lose sight of the fact that within a particular sector there are different and often very sharply delineated interests, depending on whom you're talking about. See, we've got a question here from Narissa Subramani from The Citizen. Are there other countries that implement this model of publicly funded schools? I presume we're talking about the vouchers here. And if so, where? A model like this would also require a new financial ecosystem. Do you think SA has the ability to pioneer such an ecosystem? I'm going to bat this over to Caiden, and then I'll actually take a stab myself. This is where the fun stuff starts. Caiden,
yeah, thank you very much for the question there. So there lots of places have tried it. Sometimes it works and sometimes it hasn't worked. I think that what we learn from the literature, of which there's a whole ton of literature on this, is that it seems to the most important thing seems to be in how you design your voucher system, depending on the context that you're in. I mean, take a place like Chile, for example, which is probably, a good case, because in the 80s they implemented a voucher system because they were concerned about the very things that we're concerned about. There was massive inequality, and a lot of schools were just failing students, but they also had quite a robust private sector, private schooling, and so they implemented a universal voucher system, and it didn't really seem to work that well. It didn't make things worse, but it didn't really seem to help the inequality. But then what they did in about 2007, I think it was, or 2008, they just came up with a different plan, and they stuck to the voucher system, but they actually handed out vouchers according to need. So if you in a certain socioeconomic bracket, your voucher was actually worth more, which meant that you could join your middle class peers at a much better school. And then what was also happening is the state was actually encouraging private schools to accept these vouchers and stuff like that, and so they were subsidized a little bit, and like now all of a sudden Chile's education system, I mean, has improved drastically. Now, that's not saying that, I mean, we should implement those things. That's just an example of how you can maybe implement a voucher system, but then you just got to tweak it in certain ways to actually match the context. And I mean, India are having a lot of success with it. They've actually just, so they started it in a few states, but now they've actually just increased it to other states because it is working well there. Colombia have done it, which has worked quite well. Pakistan have done it. Israel have done it. So yeah, so I think that what's quite nice for us is that we won't really be pioneering this. We have other systems to actually look to and say, okay, that didn't work there. Is that going to work here? This is what India did, you know, so we can kind of tailor it nicely. America, actually a lot of states in America have tried it, but there what's quite interesting is it's the private sector. So philanthropists and private corporations, they're the ones that have been handing out the vouchers, which is actually quite interesting. So like it actually hasn't been the government there, and that's worked really, really well in certain states. So yeah, there are a lot of lessons to be learned, but I think that that's a good thing that there is a lot of literature out there, and I think that, yeah, we should seriously consider this.
If I can just pick up on this, I think that any reform effort in South Africa has to reckon with the harsh reality that we have a state that, to put it delicately, performs suboptimally, particularly when there are large amounts of money involved, and it's a reality that goes beyond ideology or policy preference, that the state is often simply not up to it. I think one of the advantages of what we are proposing is that we want to sort of draw on the best of what civil society and the private sector are able to do, without excluding the state. And obviously, you know, as this proceeds, you know, we would want to get serious about educational reform. You know, hence the comments about the teachers union. Now, on the question of financing, look, I don't think there's any way to get around this, that it's a major risk. You know, anything that shifts expenditure has invites fears of capture. But I think that is unfortunately just something that goes with being in contemporary South Africa. I think that, you know, this would need to be paired with some very real considerations about what the priorities of the state administration are. Now, you know, this opens up to a much bigger canvas. If you think, for instance, that the government is now, and this is close to 30 years into democracy, are talking about a program to, quote, professionalize the public service. You know, you can see the depth of the crisis we're in. But I do think that you know, while there are major risks, I think the risks of doing nothing are probably far worse. You know, I would say that the consequences of a failing education system, the cognitive wastelands to which Caiden referred, circumscribe the opportunities and the life options of so many millions of South Africa's poorest people, shut them out of the opportunities for mobility that an economy that increasingly is providing opportunities predominantly for the skilled and for and for those able to work in a post-industrial economy. About 2 weeks ago, we were here talking about the massive growth of financial services as a contributor to employment in South Africa, and that's something for which you need an education. The risks of doing nothing are astronomical, and I think that there's something particularly sad and somewhat shameful about refusing to do this because we are in hock to particular political or administrative interests. That to my mind is just no longer an argument.
Yeah, I mean, it might sound like a bit crude sometimes, I think, when you speak about, schools attracting customers and stuff like that, because I mean, shouldn't like kind of education be like a basic right, and so like it does sound a bit crude sometimes, but then I just fall back on, well, what other choice do we have? I mean, if this works, I mean, pragmatically we have to do it. I mean, I think ideally you would just want, like a state that's really competent and that is, able to provide education for everybody of a good quality, but we don't have that. And none of these figures that I've cited are very new. These are we can't sit around and wait for the government to all of a sudden go, oh yeah, no, we're going to change. We're going to promise this and this and this, and I mean, they're just never going to do it. We know that. We've been the literacy problem. I mean, we've known this. I mean, since the early 2000s. Yet the government. I mean, what Mr. Ramaphosa will like often kind of talk about is like a national reading plan, and like we need to sort this out. Okay, but the government has actually in certain provinces and certain schools actually done quite good things, and they actually have affected reading in those schools by like employing coaches and then training teachers how to like kind of teach reading and maths effectively. And that has worked, but at very small scale. But what's so telling is that we've never had a budget for like a national reading plan. Mr. Ramaphosa can like kind of talk about it, and Mrs. Mocheke can, trumpet this. Yet there's no plan. I think that there was a plan put to Parliament like in 2008 about a national reading plan, but nothing after that. So I mean, yeah, we can't. It might not be ideal, like it would be really nice for the state to be able to provide education, but in South Africa, we're not going to get that anytime soon, I don't think. And so a voucher system, to me, just seems like the most pragmatic response, and we need to do it now before the situation gets even worse.
Let me just pick up on something you said there. You mentioned targeted interventions, and in your last comment you mentioned a national reading plan. This is one of your recommendations. Now, obviously, if you can't read, it's game over. That's the skill you need to acquire skills. What should we be doing, or what are we failing to do?
I think that, well, what we could be doing, and like I just mentioned earlier, I mean, there are some positive things happening in certain provinces regarding reading, but it's just very, very small scale. So, but what's nice is that it shows that you can train teachers, like in-service training. It does work. It's not enough, but it does work. So, I mean, with the voucher system, with the education department not having to kind of deal with, like all the administration that comes with providing education, etc. This might free them up to really like kind of, like expand those interventions that have been working in certain provinces. So I think that would be one. I mean, mass education campaigns, I think, for parents, might be a good idea. And I mean, improving libraries in schools and those kind of things could work. Yeah, and then I mean, a massive thing, of course, is the university education departments. If we're not, I mean, we can spend all the time we want, like kind of giving in-service training to teachers. That's good, but you got to fix the problem at the source, which is the kind of BEd courses. I mean, I was just shocked to hear that not all of our universities are teaching their prospective primary school teachers how to teach reading. Yet, I mean, it's such a problem in this country. So, I mean, I would say that these schools of education need to be audited. I mean, they do have, mandates to actually teach these things, but yeah, like I mentioned earlier, they're just paying lip service to it. And
right.
I mean, I'm not sure the reasons for that, but that needs to be investigated, I think. And we just need to make sure that our primary school teachers are being taught the correct things.
Right. Well, I think this is also an area where broader school communities should be getting involved. I think that a lot of lip service is paid to getting families and communities involved. I'm not sure to what extent this is actually happening, and I suspect that it's probably more a function of your better performing middle class schools. But that to me seems something that needs to be happening. Sarah, you've had some experience with education. What would you recommend?
The fundamental is the training, so that you actually start off with a decent base, and it includes a certain amount of ethical training, etc., and how to deal with children, what to pass on to them, and that sort of thing. So the extent to which the universities are not training aspirant teachers properly is a real disgrace. The other thing is, and you'll know me, that I beat on about the fact that schools are not different. Well, obviously they're different to other workplaces, to commercial workplaces, but organizations that have structures have to be run efficiently, effectively, and one of those issues is discipline, and discipline may ultimately result in dismissal if a teacher just cannot produce the goods. And that has to happen, because you cannot sort of save the teacher at the expense of the children. They have to come first. They and their parents are your clients, or the school's clients. And I think that's the approach at which you have to be looked at. And this is why private schooling and a voucher system have appeal, because you do require taking accountability for things. And I think it's probably reflected most sadly in the schools where you have children who've died in pit toilets. I mean, obviously one doesn't necessarily expect the management of the school, who will probably largely be women, to fix the toilets, but to either ignore the problem or let it ride until something happens, not get creative about dealing with it, says a great deal about the quality of our teachers, ironically.
Right.
So, oh gosh, there's plenty to say. One comment I'd just like to make, because I think it's sort of emblematic of why early schooling and proper schooling is so important. Some years ago, when Eskom was still producing electricity, I chatted to the person responsible for the adult literacy program. And I asked her, what is generally the proportion of success? And she said 27%. And she said it's largely because, obviously, depending on the age, depending on the person, your brain stops being able to absorb things that it is not accustomed to. So the whole process of learning to read and the strictures that go around it, and what is required of your intellect, it's long since past that point. And so adult literacy is certainly an option, but it is not by any means an alternative.
Right. Look, if I can just chip in something I alluded to earlier there. Teaching in South Africa, I think, to some extent, has been seen as an accessible white collar profession. And many people who, through no fault of their own, were not able to access alternatives went into it where they were not temperamentally suited for it, and this was very much not what they wanted to do, but it was what was available. Countries that have valued their education system. You can think about Taiwan, where I lived for a number of years, Germany, the Scandinavian countries, even a country like Zimbabwe. Teachers were held in high regard and were expected and are expected to be repositories of knowledge and expertise, and to pass those on. It's interesting. In Chinese culture, there is actually a specific word, a specific title for teacher, Lao Su, and that is used as a in place of Mr. Or Mrs. It would be, and I think there is a need to think differently about this. I think we're approaching the end of our time. Caiden, any last words from you there?
No, nothing, Terence. I think everything you and Sarah have said is really fantastic and worth thinking about. And thank you to everybody that came to listen. And I hope there are positive things on the horizon for education in the country.
I think we all do. And please remember, those who are joining us, we at the Institute and Caiden are available for questions and comments. Just reach out to us. We're very, very happy to speak to you. And do remember to download and read the full report. For media queries, contact Sinalo Tuku at sinalo@irr.org.za, SINAOL@irr.org.za. And with that, let me bring the proceedings to a close, and thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks.